the development of the homes we need and the infrastructure around the country. And indeed, if we just think around the recent discussions around the planning and infrastructure bill, and indeed, yesterday's budget, I think it just shows how critical a topic this is. So I'm going to hand over to Dieter now. Dieter's going to spend half an hour or so sort of sharing his thoughts, and then we're going to have lots of time for Q&A. So please do put your questions in the chat. And we'll look then to have a really lively and interactive discussion. So, Dieter, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for inviting me along to give this talk this evening, and more importantly, the Q&A coming up. As I'm going to explain, what's in front of us is challenging, and the wildlife trusts are an incredibly important part of that. And I'll try to illustrate some of the areas, particularly in the conversation, where that role, leadership and delivery is of such great importance. So I'm going to talk in sort of 2 or 3 bits. I'm going to start off just with a bit of context, because I think, echoing what Rupert said, there is really quite a challenging framework that's surrounding us at the moment in policy terms, and the challenges that go with that. So I want to just put that bit of context out there. And I think it is important to understand that for those who think the solution to our problems is no growth, well, we live in a no growth society. We haven't had any growth for some time, and we're unlikely to get much growth going forward. And that's really important for context. I'll then stand back from that and saying, well, what would a sustainable economy look like? And in particular, what would sustainable consumption and sustainable economic growth be? We hear all about, we must have growth, but you have to be clear what it is and what we would have to do if we really wanted to live within a sustainable framework. And I'm going to go from that discussion on to some particular policy contexts, which I'm sure are very pertinent to yourselves and are part and parcel of this bigger debate. Housing's one of them, water is another, and energy fits into that frame. And I'll try and wind up with looking at some of the areas where wildlife trusts can make the greatest contributions. So if I start off with what I call realism, you might call it pessimism, but I think pessimism is not the right word. It's about realistically understanding where we are, what the challenges that confront us are, and not just us as people who really care about the environment, but people across the economy more generally, and how those challenges are perceived. You have to understand where everyone else is coming from if you really want to make the case for nature and show why nature helps everyone achieve the objectives which are widely shared. So let me start off with some realism. So, we live in a no growth economy. Growth is naught. It's true that there's a little bit of GDP positive, but the population's been growing very quickly. GDP per head, that's what really matters, is not as pretty as GDP, even though that's pretty glum. And the forecasts going forward are now for about 1.5% GDP growth going forward. So that means that GDP per head will be less than that, but that isn't very much in a context in which the tax take is going to 38% of the economy. And however you disguise it and however much you try to look for stealthy ways of raising money, almost everyone is going to feel no substantial improvement in what they see as affordability in their living standards between now and 2030. I wish I could tell you something different, but I can't. That's what the forecasts actually say, and that's what the tax changes actually mean. And this is the highest take by government for 80 years from the economy, and you can't take all that lot out without having some consequences. Now, what this means in the economy more generally is reflected in the reasons why that growth is so low. it's not because we're not building enough houses. And it's actually not because we're behind on what I regard as a mad dash to 2030 net zero. These were supposed to be the growth drivers, but we're actually building very few houses, nothing like we used to build after the Second World War. And it's not clear that house builders have any interest in building the sorts of housing for rent, social housing, etc., urban housing that we would need to build if we were to address the housing demand. So remember, rising population means a demand for more houses. This isn't meant as an anti or pro immigration point, but if you add 1.5 million people to the population in the space of 2 or 3 years, you need quite a lot of houses to put them in. And that in itself pushes up the demand for development and housing. And, you can't wish not to have the housing unless you wish not to have the demand for housing. And that's a pretty tough argument to take through. On net zero, it's really important to understand that what's going on in the energy sector is not investment. It's all projected as investment, and the idea being that we should borrow to invest. Actually, we are replacing one set of assets to produce an output called electricity. So when you turn the switch, the lights go on, with another set of assets to produce exactly the same outcome. And indeed, what we are now doing is requiring twice the total capacity, 120 gigawatts as opposed to 60, to produce that same output. We're requiring a doubling of the transmission grid, an upgrade of the distribution grid, and all the battery storage, pump storage, and then 10 gigawatts of interconnectors to produce exactly the same outcome. To pretend that's investment is to commit what's called the broken windows fallacy. This was an example from the middle of the 19th century by a French economist who pointed out an example in which some youngsters come along the street and throw stones through the windows of a shopkeeper. And the argument is, well, this is great because, of course, what's going on here is there's going to be a greater demand for the services of glaziers. There's going to have to be painters, decorators, etc., etc. This is all growth. And it'll come to a theme in a moment. It is actually higher GDP. If you have a disaster like the flooding of New Orleans, well, the answer to that is that adds to GDP. But of course it doesn't. We're not better off because someone broke the windows, and we're not better off because rightly we've closed the coal stations if we have to build some separate ones. Carbon emissions are somewhat different, but then remember, we're still importing coal. It's being imported in Chinese steel as opposed to being produced by a coal power station in the UK. So we have to be very careful in having in our minds that building loads of houses and building lots of transmission cables, wind farms and solar panels are good arguments for doing these things. But the argument that isn't there is that they're going to be high growth activities. They're not. And I think that's worth having in mind. The people who are most concerned about some of our economic growth problems are not just people who are hostile and want to spit out words like newts, disco, fish, bats, etc. There are people who think like that. And indeed, it's a sad part of British politics that leading politicians spit these words out as a sort of act of performance politics. But behind all this lies a really big concern. If the British economy is to compete in the world, and it has to, we have to address some fundamental problems. We have the most expensive electricity for industry in the developed world, and almost the most expensive electricity for domestic customers. Germany's a close second, but for example, energy costs are 4 times lower in the United States and somewhere like that in China. And energy pervades everything. And by the way, 84% of energy is fossil fuels worldwide, and 76% of energy in the UK is fossil fuels as well. And if you can't have competitively priced electricity, then you can't compete in almost anything. And many of you will have noticed from just following the press in the last few months, Grangemouth is closing and turning into an import facility. The Esso petrochemical plant in Scotland is closing. Port Talbot is effectively closed for steel. Scunthorpe Steel is effectively closed and nationalised. The fertiliser industry is closed. The fiberglass industry is closed. The biofuel industry is closed, actually for energy cost purposes. We're now importing nearly 40% of our cement into this country. Aluminium's, of course, long gone. The car industry's production recently fell back to the levels in the late 1940s. It's now back to the 1950s level. You can't turn your back on the economic consequences to our economy and therefore to its citizens of the fact that these things are going on in our economy and we're deindustrializing fast. And that just has a flick across into the sorts of things that come face to face with the concerns of environmentalists. So we have the most expensive nuclear power stations in the world. It costs 12 billion to produce 1 gigawatt of new capacity in nuclear. Nobody else is anywhere in this frame. HS2 costs $750 million a mile. Put that in perspective. If it wasn't funny, if it wasn't so sad, it'd be funny. You can have 15 miles of HS2 or Hinkley. They're about the same cost. It's going to cost at least 49 billion as the opening bid, and it'll be much more probably, to build another runway from tarmac and concrete at Heathrow and some sheds or terminals at the end of it. These costs completely put the UK out of the world's markets and they increase the internal framework. And therefore, there's a great search for people to find out, why is growth so low? Why are things so expensive in the UK? Why can't we get things built? And then the kickback comes from all the lobby interests. Oh, it must be the fault of those blockers in the environmental movements. If only we could reduce environmental regulation, all would be well. Now, it turns out as a matter of, I think, fact, that the one thing that isn't the major cost component in these areas, except where very silly things are done, is the environment. But the lobbyists who want to build houses on the green belt are not going to miss an open goal if the Treasury is prepared to do whatever's necessary to, quote, promote economic growth. Why not listen to the house builders, as if house builders had an interest in building as many houses as possible and driving down the price of houses? Why not listen to the developers of X, Y, and Z when it's convenient for them not to do net biodiversity gain? Why not eliminate net biodiversity gain from small developments? Now, what is used in this argument, which I think is really more than questionable, is one or two standout examples. So every time this issue comes up about what's the impact of nature on the environment, we're told about examples like the £100 million bat tunnel for HS2. Oh, and the fish disco and whether it saved one salmon or not at Hinkley. What these examples are really good illustrations of how you could do vastly better for the environment if you approached both of these two examples in a more enlightened way. If it costs 100 million to protect the bats that were protected or not, in fact, by the tunnel in HS2, what could you, if you spent that 100 million elsewhere on improving the natural environment, deliver? If I sent Rupert a check for 100 million, what could the Somerset Wildlife Trust do with that? And with the fish disco issue, I mean, it's ludicrous in all its forms, the way the argument goes forward. But if it really does cost that much to not have a water inlet which is fish proof, What could you have done instead with the money that would have been available to improve huge aspects of the breeding areas, etc., for fish, which go into the Severn Estuary, etc.? I make those examples. So let me stand back from this difficult circumstance, and provided you will let me have the argument that no growth is not a great place to be, and right now no growth is not producing good results for the environment, let's ask a couple of questions. First of all, what is sustainable growth? What is a sustainable economy? And then secondly, why is nature the central building block for that? Well, on the first point, you have to look at this from a generational perspective. We are stewards of this planet. Every generation has a temporary leasehold on the planet. And the way a sustainable economy works is that each generation makes sure that they hand on what they have been stewards of to the next generation in at least as good state as they found it. That was why, and immodestly I'll claim authorship for this, that's why I came up with, and the Natural Capital Committee supported, and Michael Gove enacted the 25-year plan. 25 years, just a rough guess, a generation, doesn't matter what the number is. And the idea was to leave the natural environment in at least as good a state or better state within 25 years. And the idea was a plan to actually deliver that. It's been emasculated by this government, and that has detrimental effects on people, on nature, and yes, on the economic growth of the economy itself. But that's the central idea. It's really simple idea. It's easy to grasp. You wouldn't want your children, if you have children or grandchildren, to have a worse world than you have. And indeed, one of the broader complaints of the young is that their life expectations, their expectations of their standard of living are lower than they think their parents have. That's not for anyone a satisfactory result when it comes down to a family, for a society, or for an economy. Now, to make sure that you can do that and you deliver that sustainable economy and you make sure you meet your generational obligations, you have to bequeath to the next generation a set of assets as good as we inherited, and those assets then enable the future generation to choose how they live their life. It's not our job to make them happy. It's not our job to tell them how to live their lives. It is to give them the facility, the assets from which they can make that choice. You need a balance sheet. By the way, GDP has no balance sheet at all. Again, why it's a terrible measure of what's going on. Now, a balance sheet puts in the center the most important assets first. And for an economy, these assets are the main infrastructures, the energy infrastructure, the cyber broadband infrastructure, the rail infrastructure, the road infrastructure, the water infrastructure, the sewage infrastructure, and so on. So the physical assets, we should make sure that the trains run at least as well for 25 years' time as they do now, to put it in a very concrete form. But if you ask what are the most important assets upon which everything else depends and upon which an economy can be sustained, they are the natural environments. They are primary. Without these primary environmental assets, the ecosystems, the biodiversity, and the atmosphere, which is an asset, a stock, without those, then nothing else is sustainable. And you can see that in the example of climate change. So, everyone bangs on about emissions. And worse, they bang on about territorial emissions as if it matters whether you produce a ton of carbon in the UK or you import it in the steel from China. But they think territorial emissions is what is a measure of climate change. And I think if you get territorial emissions down, like the UK definitely has, then you are stopping causing climate change. It's rubbish, right? You know, what we've done in the UK is lead the world in territorial carbon emissions reductions, and in leading the world into the highest prices in the world. And we've done it by deindustrializing. That's all those companies going. But we haven't decarbonized our consumption. You write down your carbon diary today, write down all the things you've done and try and work out how much carbon's in it. And then write it down as if you were in 25 years' time and you thought you were at net zero, and ask yourself, what have you cut out? And in particular, where has it come from? And you'll find a big chunk, because we're a very open trade economy, of what you're consuming carbon is just carbon emissions in China for your benefit, but you don't count those. That's nonsense. Okay, so you have to be really focused on which are the assets that really matter. But of those, as I say, it's the ecosystems, it's the biodiversity, and it's the atmosphere. These are the primary assets. Without those, without that nature, there is no sustainable economic growth. And that comes to the next point. I have never met a person, but maybe just I mix with the wrong people, but I have never met anybody who thinks what we're doing now is sustainable. I've never met anyone who thinks that what's going on in climate change is sustainable. I've never met anyone who thinks what's going on in the Amazon, the Congo, the rainforest, the temperate rainforest, the Siberian forest, the lakes, the major rivers of the world, what's going on there is sustainable. And I'd be interested if anybody listening today thinks that what we're doing on this planet is sustainable. Now, if you think like me that it isn't sustainable, you have to draw a conclusion. And this is the remarkable thing, that people don't seem to be able to jump from it isn't sustainable to the conclusion, which is therefore it will not be sustained. That's the definition of sustainable. You know, it's only the sustainable that can be sustained through time. It's only the sustainable that allows us to pass on to the next generation and a set of assets at least as good as we inherited. And when you come to climate change, the other point in climate change that is important is, you know, people think, as I said earlier, it's all about emissions. But what about sequestration? You know, the stock of carbon in the atmosphere is what matters. It's how many parts per million carbon there is up there. And just an aside, we've been adding 2 parts per million every single year since 1990, except the year before last when it was 3, and last year when it was 3.5 parts per million. That's why we're at over 420 parts per million, and that's why our unsustainable path is going to 500 parts per million, and later on this century to doubling the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere from the pre-industrial level. But you might say, how's that been every single year? Surely during COVID, we shut everything down. Surely emissions fell very sharply. Yeah, of course they did. But what we're doing is damaging sequestration potential to suck that stuff back out. So the most scary thing I heard during the lockdowns was when it was discovered that bits of the Amazon are now net emitters of carbon. So if you go on cutting down your rainforests, if you go on trashing your landscape, if you go around concreting all over, you will have a consequence for sequestration. And that and if you pollute the oceans too, and that sequestration means that even if you put less emissions in the atmosphere, you still might be making climate change worse because you're doing so much damage on the sequestration side. And when you look at the marshes, which come within the Somerset area, and you look at how much sequestration is taking place, if you look at the gradual, slow formation of peatlands, the sphagnum mosses and so on, and then you contrast it with the digging up of peat, which has been a feature of Somerset's history for a very long time, you can see you need to turn your eyes very closely to the land, the management of the land, and particularly its capacity to soak up carbon. And you need to get a bit more educated and think all we have to do is plant lots and lots of spruce conifer trees, and that'll be an offset and it'll all be fine. It won't. If you just want to plant trees to buy an offset to absorb carbon as possible, cover the whole lot in eucalyptus trees. They're really fast at soaking up carbon and will be an environmental catastrophe if that's the route we went down. So you have to be focused here on actually addressing these assets, and it's the state of those assets which takes you through to sustaining your economic growth. And the growth itself comes from the amazing technical progress going on all around us. That's really what causes a growth. I'm talking to you with an iPhone in my pocket, which is more powerful than Oxford University's complete computer in 1980 was. It's phenomenal. My world has changed dramatically from when I started with an Olympus portable typewriter with Tipp-Ex and carbon paper. That's progress. Some of it's bad. Some of the social media is questionable. There are all sorts of downsides, but the overall impact is the possibility of sustainable growth. And quantum computing, AI, synthetic biology, etc., are coming at such an accelerating rate that in principle, the capacity for the next generation to be better off than we are, provided they don't trash the planet, is actually quite good. But you have to put the focus where it might lie. And so this all comes back to the land. Of course, the seas fit in this frame too, about the management of the land and about each custodian or steward, or in your case, trustees for your wildlife trust, how good they are at stewarding the asset they've got and taking it forward for next generations to consider. You may be thinking about what Somerset Wildlife looks like in 2030. I'm actually quite interested in what it looks like in 2080 or 2100, because this is an open-ended commitment through time that needs to be carried through. And because we have done so much damage, and sadly, a lot of it's come from agriculture and draining, and the Somerset levels have had all the, I would say, benefit or disadvantage of that going forward. We can't simply say, well, it's a terrible state, but we won't make it any worse. What we can say is we can make it so much better. We can enhance the assets for the next generation. And, you only have to be a completely amateur naturalist like me and walk around bits of Exmoor and walk around bits of the Somerset levels and other dimensions of, in your case, Somerset Wildlife Trust area, to see not just how good some of it is, but what the potential for improvement is. It's just enormous what's been done in the last 10 or 15 years positively, but what can now be done taking forward. And that goes onto the balance sheet, that enhances the assets, and that contributes, because they're enhanced assets, to the next generation having a better natural environment than we have, and therefore we delivering in full on our necessary commitment to them as to what they're going to get from us. And so, I can go from the most micro bit about how a wildlife trust can influence whether or not the design of a housing estate, has small ponds in it, whether it has broken surfaces as opposed to solid concrete, right through to, the broad picture of this marshland restoration that's happening in Somerset. I can picture it across the pace. I can think through how the state of the rivers of Somerset can be markedly improved, how pollution runoff can be dealt with, how the rivers can be rewilded back to their previous shapes. And really crucially, and this is my last point, and I'll stop here so we've got plenty of time for questions. If you want to pass on to the next generation a set of natural assets, at least as good we inherited them, you concentrate on the next generation, because that's our responsibility, on the idea that it's a chain letter, that the next generation will look after the one after that, and so on and so forth into the future. What is special in this generational game is education and the children. And, the nature's great in itself, although nature doesn't care in the way humans do, but it's there for people to engage with, and it will only be protected and enhanced if people care about it. We live in a world now where in the UK, 80% of the population is urban. Recently, I was trying to explain to one of my students that you can't trade off iPhones with swallows, less swallows, but don't worry, you've got an iPhone. And one of them said, "What's a swallow?" And then I realized just how bereft knowledge is in the society about what nature actually comprises. You take a 5-year-old child and you put them in a hay meadow, you put them in to see the bluebells in a beech wood, you put them in a field to see cowslips in a sea of yellow, and you'll think of lots and lots of examples in your own case. That sticks with them for the rest of their life. And if in 2080, they are the people who are 5 now, who'll be well through their lives, but thinking about what they're handing on, they need that grounding and baseline. And the degree of what I'd call natural history ignorance in our society is a major blocker to unlocking the economic growth, sustainable economic growth advantages of nature. Nature's a benefit, not a cost. It's true that doing stupid things might lead people to see nature as the obstacle. 100 million for a bat tunnel is not sensible, but it's also not sensible for there to be no serious compensation to nature for the damage that's done by doing the tunneling that took place in the case of HS2. Similarly, Hinckley and the fish disco. People have to understand what this is about in order to support what's necessary. And it's true that a child of 5 to 10 may well love and engage in nature. Just going down to sea pools and paddling around is part of that frame. And when they're teenagers, they may go into a completely different world. But what's sown in a child about nature between 5 and 10 will come back to them in their life, and they will be your next ambassadors for the Somerset Wildlife Trust, and they will be the next generation of volunteers that build what are great assets and incredibly valuable ones, and in our world as it is at the moment, ones growing in more and more value through time. So let's not have a no-growth society, which many environmentalists want. Let's have a sustainable economy with sustainable consumption and sustainable economic growth. Let's base it on assets, and particularly natural assets, and let's explain in that frame why nature is a benefit to that sustainable economic growth, not a detriment. And the other way around, the absence of nature is unsustainable, and it will bring the whole house down upon us. And sooner than later, by which I mean it matters in this century, not sometime in 200 or 300 years' time. And so we should cherish, protect, be proud of, and advocate for more and more nature protection as a pro-sustainable growth policy. Thank you.
Dieter, that's fantastic. Thank you. I think setting out there not just what is a sustainable economy, but kind of why we need one. And I think that responsibility and indeed urgency of us now bequeathing those assets on, as you put it, to the next generation, and how vital it is, and therefore, what we need to start doing now. There's lots of questions in the chat, and I'm going to, try to cover as many of those as we can go through. So do please, people keep putting those questions in. But I guess one of the ones, and I think it's in some of the sort of questions there now that I just wanted perhaps to start off with. You've talked about that bequeathing those assets for the next generation. Indeed, you've talked about that sort of 2080 or 2100, that sort of timescale. And the government has come up, from time to time in your sort of piece there. How does our government just, balance what effectively we can argue is quite a sort of short-term approach for a lot of the way our sort of, political processes work, with that kind of, investment in those choices for the future?
Well, this government follows us. I would say, well, 33% of us did vote for this government, right? The lowest turnout, by the way, the lowest vote for any government forming a majority, I think, certainly since the Second World War. But, you know, more people voted Labour than they voted any other party. And they reflect the fact that people thought that what they were advocating to do was better than what the other lot were advocating to do. You know, we blame our politicians for this stuff. It's us that vote for these people, and these people want to get elected, and they're thinking about how to get re-elected in 3.5 years' time, and they're trying to reflect what people want. Okay, so we have to be, this is a broader issue with us, the citizens, than it is with the politicians who may or may not well reflect what it is that people wish to choose. Okay, so I think it's quite important, this frame, to be understanding. And it's like when people blame the Treasury for all sorts of things. Well, you know, where's the money going to come from otherwise? We want to vote for more expenditure and lower taxes. It's the classic frame. Right? But how do you connect the long term to the short term? Well, it's a fundamental problem about the British economy in particular. You know, you may not agree with the technology, and I have mixed views, but, you know, France built 52 nuclear reactors, 6 at one time. They didn't build them for the current government that was elected in, say, 1980 or 1976 or something. They built them for the long run. Okay, lots of things do get built for the long run. We don't. And one of the reasons we don't is because our growth rate is very low. And actually, we've never been particularly successful relative to other economies, well, it's really since the Second World War, but particularly for the last 40, 50 years. There is no money. The second reason is that we don't have a framework, and in particular cross-party framework, which channels savings into investment. So we have phenomenally low savings in the UK. If you look at capital depreciation, stuff we should be maintaining, the government, we live in a situation where the savings ratio is net of capital depreciation negative in this country. All the capital investment taking place in this country, most of the government borrowing is all foreign. It's really important to understand that. Okay, it's not your money and my money. Your money and my money and savings for our pensions doesn't cover even the capital depreciation. We've never wanted to do that. And that's almost a cultural outcome. But now we've got to the end of the road. You can't patch and mend the water system any longer. The sewers won't stand patch and mend. The water treatment works won't do it. You know, one failure at Copperfield in London will be devastating for water supply. If anyone watched the television programme on Thames Water, a look at what was going on at the Mogden sewage works should scare the hell out of anybody. Right? I mean, you know, if you look at our railways, you know, they're patch and mend. Right? This is our strategy. We have to have a recognition that the traditional growth story in Britain was boost spending, get people out in the shops, and that'll lead to growth because it'll lead to demand. You wouldn't say that in China. You'd say build a railway, build an energy system, build an EV industry, and you would be automatically thinking about the building blocks. So my answer is there are deep cultural reasons and economic reasons why we're lousy at this. But the nice thing about now is this is the point where what we've traditionally done just obviously doesn't work. And the case for long term to make now is into a much more fertile territory because almost anyone can see short term patch and mend doesn't work. And that's true of the environment too. You have to think long term. If you think of some of the, I mean, I'm only peripherally familiar with this, but if you think of some of the great things that have been done, and I come back to the Somerset levels because I can think of bits of Exmoor, etc., where great things should have been done and haven't been done, right? Okay, they weren't done for a year's return, right? Those things are there for the rest of the century. And that's the long-term thinking, which is absolutely the core of sustainable economic growth. You must do the capital maintenance. You must patch and mend properly before you invest, but you must also enhance what you've got for the long term. And my simple answer is the short-term stories run out of road.
Yeah. I'm going to try to crack through some of the questions.
Yeah.
There's a lot of questions going through. So actually,
Sorry,
one
I'll
of
give
them
you a long
actually
answer.
no, no, it's I've really, I mean, but I think exactly what people want to hear your views about. And one of the things talks about the fact that, I think the governance would have solved this and that we could regulate businesses to do the right thing, but that isn't going to happen. So actually, this needs to be, back to your point about, we're responsible for these things in terms of who we vote in, etc. So there's a sense that we need to create a movement. I guess it's your sort of views on how do we start to build that change and that energy amongst all of us.
Okay, so there are two things there. Just sort of an aside on the regulation side, etc. Actually, it would be quite helpful to stop digging really deep and silly holes in the short run. So anyone who's followed the saga of Thames Water, you couldn't make it up. You really couldn't. And you couldn't regulate it worse than's been done. Phenomenal financial engineering has been announced. The state of the assets has deteriorated terribly. The river is in a terrible state. I know that because that's part of what I see every day, one of the tributaries when I'm in Oxford. And so we do need to bear down on regulation. We do need to get that right. We need to get the day-to-day environmental regulation right too. And with merging EA and Ofwat, I mean, God knows what happens with the Ofwat bit, but this is a chance to say, what's the EA for? What should it do? What resources need? So that's aside. But my argument to my reply to the thing about how do you get people on board to this and how do you make it happen? Something I didn't mention, which is part of the technical progress and a phenomenal opportunity for those who want to support and encourage nature. The new digital technologies enable anyone in principle sitting in their front room or the kitchen table to see what's going on in real time on every 20 square meters of the planet. That was not true 5-10 years ago. You can now see exactly which bits of the Amazon are on fire, and you can see exactly what's happening on particular farms. You can spot from space the sewage outflows by the color of the water change in real time. And AI and then quantum computing are going to make this not just a good idea that's technically possible, but we're not really doing it, to being every day. Just as in 5 to 10 years' time, if you go to the doctor, they can probably put your genome up on the screen and see your entire genetic makeup and be able to massively transform what they can do on health service side. So what I advocate is that what you should do is you should digitally map, and not the whole thing first, but just start. I'm very interested in rivers, so I would digitally map the Thames. And I would put the digital map of the Thames with the real-time data of everything that's happening in that valley, all the farms, all the component parts, all the building developments, all the sewage outflows, the state of the river, all the new sensor data in an open data platform. I'd put it on the web, and then I'd say, look, this is what it looks like now. Now, you think it'd be a great idea to have a natural capital solution upstream in this river by basically putting the wriggles back in it, what's called re-wriggling, and this would slow the flow and that would improve flood defense and reduce pollution. Let's take the map on the screen. You do it on the kitchen table, and then you change the map by putting in the thing that you propose to do. What you'll be able to do is show that that's a hell of a lot better outcome than building loads of concrete in sewage works, and in the Oxford case, building a canal around Oxford to stop the flooding, right? So you take the projects that you think in your area could improve nature and improve the sustainable nature of the economy in your area and has benefits. So you say, we'd like to do this. We'd like to buy this piece of land and reflood it. I had no idea. You can see how amateur I am. I'm a dismal scientist and not a much more interesting biologist or ecologist. But put it on the map. Change the map and say, this is what it will look like. It's like, when you see a building development and the architects show you this glossy picture of how lovely it's going to look with trees and plants and stuff, and it isn't going to. But this enables anybody in principle to engage, trying out their own ideas, and for you to actually show in an open data framework what this looks like. Now, you won't be able to do that today, but in 5 years' time, it'll be the core asset, apart from the land, of the Somerset Wildlife Trust, to have that data and that data framework and to be able to see exactly what's going on and optimize what you're doing and allow people to play with it and entertain and engage. And then you can do the advocacy which produces the answer. We will show you how to increase economic growth by doing the right things for nature in our area. So I think that's a fantastic opportunity. We're not there yet. I'm not a data scientist, but I've been looking at certain catchments for water companies, etc. And it is phenomenal how you can improve the outcomes with this frame and democratize it by making this all open data so people can engage directly with it.
Yeah, I love that vision about that sort of the power of that data and the modeling and how we could use that. I think that's super. But I'm going to take another sort of tack about, you mentioned AI there. There's some questions about AI and indeed technology, and whether actually, and I'm going to slightly sort of provoke it here, whether that's going to offer some solutions to this carbon capture and storage, some of those sequestration things you were mentioning earlier on. Are there technology solutions that mean actually we don't have to worry about these things so much? I mean, just what role does technology have to play in all of this?
Okay, well, it's not a get out of jail card, and particularly in the climate change world, there are people who think, oh, don't worry, we'll do direct air capture, we'll manipulate the atmosphere directly. We can do it, by the way. You can suck a CO2 straight out of the air if you want to do it. Costs about $1,000 a ton. It's phenomenally expensive, and it's phenomenally energy intensive to do it, right? Okay, but people think we could put a shield up there and bounce the sun back off. People want to spray the surface of the ocean with salt water to get reflectivity back off. People want to seed the upper atmosphere. Okay, and they say these technologies are there. They are all there, by the way, right? Everything I've described is perfectly theoretically possible, and most of it's being put into practice in one way or another, okay? But they say two things. They say it's all going to be fine. There are no detrimental consequences, and it's going to be so efficient. So what are you worried about solar panels and wind turbines and even conventional nuclear power stations? This is very dangerous. And it's dangerous for several reasons. First of all, these technologies have really risky unintended consequences. So we have to remember with technology that every single major technology that we've had has produced environmental detriment as well as benefit. The Haber-Bosch process enabled the world to transfer from 2 billion to 8 billion people and feed them artificial fertilizer. That's why when I drive through your area, and indeed anywhere, indeed even in Scotland last summer, there are no insects on my windscreen. And I'm old enough, and there may be a few other people on the call here, to remember stopping at motorway service stations to clean the muck off my window so I could see where I was going. They are responsible for the utter devastation of plant life. And so you have to be careful here. The thing about the solar reflectors, very dangerous, because anyone could do it for themselves. Think of the military benefits of being able to threaten someone with manipulating their weather. Very dangerous. So they have their downsides. They take time. But what they don't do is address the natural capital. They're all industrial capital, right? They're not looking after the biodiversity. They're not looking after ecosystems. They're on a path which says we can replace ecosystems with human-made capital and technologies. You can have loads of iPhones. It doesn't matter a damn if the swallows don't turn up in my barn in Exmoor anymore. I think it does. And I think that we have to be very careful. We can't be against technology for two reasons. One, we're ruling out the possibilities that are there. And secondly, it's going to happen anyway. Nobody has ever contained a technology except possibly nuclear. But apart from that, no. And we won't constrain it. Much more importantly, how can we bend this to the advantage of our natural world, and how can we ensure ourselves against the detriment? And we have to think that through. But my example of using AI and data to map what's going on, what a benefit for nature that comes from that.
No, absolutely. I think there's been, I mean, fantastic. And I'm just trying to go through the sort of questions and just sort of pick some of the themes out. There's a number there, and I think you probably touched in it and on that answer as well. If I think about some of the other sort of the barriers to this, if we think about, there are some big vested interests in terms of the fossil fuel sector, the agri sectors, whatever, and actually kind of the environment's free to use at the moment. We think about that. So I guess how do we get some shift out of that? What sort of changes are needed there?
Okay, so when we did the Agricultural Act, and you might have the farming industry as a major problem in this area, not for their own fault, but because their interests are structured in that way. When we did the Agricultural Act, there were two principles which govern everything that followed. And of course, have been terribly badly implemented, but they stand there. One is public money for public goods. That's an extraordinary breakthrough from public money for private goods and public money for owning land. That's transformational. I put a huge amount of effort in that. I'm only a bit part player in this, but the Natural Capital Committee, we drove that principle. It wasn't ours. The Treasury dreamt it up in about 2005 or 2007 when they wanted to reform the common agricultural policy inside the EU. But that's the first bit, okay? And you can see, for all the traumas that are happening in the agricultural sector, getting this principle in place has made a lot of difference already. The SFI might have been, a complete mess, but the basic farm payment's gone, and there are clusters of farmers and engagement takes place. The second one, which is much harder to win, is the polluter pays principle. Right? Now, I'm an economist. The efficient price of anything is what includes all the costs. Prices mostly do not include the costs of the main polluting activities. They don't include the cost of biodiversity, and they don't include the cost of carbon much. Right? And farmers are in the unique position, not their fault, but they're in the unique position of being the one sector of our economy who expects to be paid not to pollute. And it's very important to understand this. I mean, part of my family were farmers. I understand the psychology. Many farmers think it's my land, get off my land, the joke goes, but they're entitled to do what they like with that land. And if you want them to do something different, you pay them not to do it. Even if you want to stop them having slurry running into the river, you put up a capital grant to help do the silage clamps, etc. Right? You want to decarbonize farming, and you subsidize red diesel. Right? You can just see the issue there. Now, what this really reflects is not just the farmer's interest, and the farmers, it's all capitalized in farmland value. They don't make money out of this process in the end, right? They are in a vulnerable position. If they try to pay for the pollution they cause at the moment, given the value of land and the farming incomes, it's a disaster, right? But what it really reflects is that you and me, and forgive me for making it personal, don't really want to pay the costs of the pollution we're causing. And therefore, we really don't want to have to adjust our lifestyle to a sustainable consumption level so that we bequeath the next generation a decent environment. We don't want to pay. We want that £2.50 or £5 chicken in Tesco's or wherever, and we want the eggs, etc. We'll turn a blind eye to paying for the pollution that was wrecking the Wye and the Usk and the damage that comes to the rivers. We don't want to pay. We want cheap food. Okay, and it's the same with oil, right? I often talk to people in groups like Just Stop Oil, and people seem enamored of these people. They think the evil people are these businessmen who sit around the table, these corporate greedy executives who sit down and say, hey, let's pollute the environment a bit more today. Let's see what we can get away with. The truth is, if you want Just Stop Oil, stop buying it. You and I use fossil fuels for on average 76% of our total energy in everything that we're doing. That's what you get from your carbon diary. We do not actually want to honor the polluter pays principle. And that's almost a moral point that we have to push forward because it's economically efficient. It's a better economy. it gets better decisions, and it stops having to pay all these subsidies caused by having to clean up the mess paid because the polluters don't pay. We've got as far as to make power companies pay for carbon emissions. We've got large industrial plants having to buy carbon permits. We've done for a lot of the economy in practice, gradual introduction of the polluter pays principle. But when it comes to land and agriculture in particular, and that's a major problem in our territory, we don't. And that argument has to be won. And that's why the Agricultural Act 220, which will still be the framework for agricultural policy in 20 years' time, in my view, just like the Environment Act will be the framework. That's why we've only started on implementing what's in there, and it's a gradual process.
I think it's really important that you're making that personal, actually, and I think actually about actions that we're all taking or perhaps, not able to take. Talking there about agriculture and farming is one of the questions that I think is related to some personal changes we can make. It asks about, will the development of meat-like protein in factories or reducing land use for animal feed, indeed you could see more moving to sort of, plant-based diets, if you like, are those things that might make a difference? Is that another way to see that problem about some of those things that we can take, responsibility for and make a difference?
Okay, so here you need schizophrenia, right? So realism tells you that if you bother to vote or not, it won't make any difference. If you bother to be low carbon, it won't make much difference because climate change will be determined in India, Indonesia, China, Russia, Brazil. Brazil, that great COP country whose primary energy policy announced in advance was to be the 4th largest oil producer in the world, and was giving the drilling permits to the mouth of the Amazon next to the conference center where a road had been driven through the rainforest to get there, and 2 cruise liners were put outside to accommodate. But this is the kind of framework, you won't make any difference. That's one side. But on the other hand, there's a personal moral dimension and a recognition that if you don't go down and vote, you set an example to everybody else that they don't go and vote either. Okay. And so in a book I wrote a little bit earlier, I've just finished a recent with the publishers called Climate Realism. But in the book I wrote on net zero, I did put out this frame of write your own carbon diary. Okay. So, and what when I started off, I suggested to my students, you write your carbon diary, go and write down what you've done today, remember, try and work out how much carbon was involved in going to the loo when you got up first thing in the morning, right? And work through all these things, think what was in your breakfast, where the cereals came from, what you had for lunch, how you got to work, what your clothes are you put on, how they're made, etc. Because I wanted people to understand that their world is entirely soaked in carbon. It's what makes our world work. Right. And actually carbon is part of the natural world, etc. But we are very high carbon consumers. Then I said to them, write their carbon diary for 250 and think what they would have to do if they were no longer causing climate change in 250. And then, being very old fashioned, I said to them, now what I'd like you to do is take the second thing and post it to yourself in the future. And of course, what it means now is you put it on a file on a computer and do it. But really interesting exercise. I've tried it. Otherwise, people say, high and volatile gas prices. So I asked them to write down what they think the gas price in 240 would be. By the way, I think it'd be very low. That's an aside. And then post it to yourself. And this has 2 advantages. One is the exercise tells you that there are big things you can do to improve your local environment, not just in carbon, but in terms of the biodiversity, etc. There are really big things you can do. And secondly, that whatever you project you're going to do, you'll be wrong. Right? I had no idea when I was on my Olympus portable typewriter that we would be talking on a Zoom call like this to 100 of you people in this frame. No idea the iPhone would ever come along. We didn't have mobile phones, and the fax machine was just coming. I mentioned that to one of my students the other day, and they said, "What's a fax machine?" Right? And I go, yeah, okay, I get that, right? So, this is all part of the frame. Now, if you take out what you do and you want to improve your carbon footprint, I immediately identified that I was flying all around the world to do conferences, and ironically about climate change. And the point came just before the plague or the pandemic or whatever you like to call it came along, where I was contributing a chapter to a book some guys were doing in Harvard, and they asked me to fly over for a Saturday morning editorial conference and come back on climate change. And I just did a double take, and it just occurred to me, you know, one of those brainstorm moments, you think, this is madness, right? Why can't we have a video call or a conference call? And at that point, I decided no more international flights. Now, I'm not perfect. I haven't been abroad since 2018 on a plane, but I have made 1 or 2 internal flights in the UK. So I'm still a hypocrite, right? I'm just not as bad as I was. The carbon I've taken out is wonderful. I can do this conference with you today. I've done one already this morning. My life is a lot better. And to put the idea to you, imagine if you never, ever was going to have to go to Heathrow Airport again or Bristol. Just imagine how much better your life would be. And you find out that there are quite a lot of things you can do personally, which improve your local community, contribute to your community. You can volunteer for a wildlife trust to make things better, and you can change your carbon footprint. And the really interesting thing is this is win-win. It makes your life better as a result. And that's part and parcel of the message. And I've never been to a meeting with your volunteers, but I have with a different wildlife trust, is understanding how much better you make their life if they do good things for nature. And so I think that's where it becomes very personal. But, you know, with no purists, I've got solar panels, I've got an electric car, but I know how much pollution is involved in making the battery for my electric car. And I know that there were Uyghur people used in making my solar panels on my roof. And I know I'm still using fossil fuels in various ways. So I'm still a hypocrite, but it's about being a bit better rather than being perfect. And that's where I object to no growth, let's rewild everything, etc. I think in the end, you have to be pragmatic. What can you personally best do in your own, and it's for all of us, little ways which make your life, your family's life, your children's life, and your community life better. And it makes it still possible for those swallows to turn up in the spring.
Dieter, that's a lovely point. And I think the power there, that there are things that we, each of us can do. And actually, you make the point, and I love the point. Thank you for making the point about the volunteering for the Wildlife Trust, because, you know, those things often they're sort of framed that people have to give up things and stop things. Actually, you're saying you can also do things that are really going to enhance and add to your life. And actually, there was a soundbite this morning. I won't get the maths quite right, but basically, this how each of us doing something makes a difference was talking about, you know, if you get 7 people who all decide to make that change, and each of those 7 influences 7 people. You only need to do that 12 times and you're into a number like 13 billion. The point is, there is real power in us each doing that. Come to the question. Someone has actually, so there's some respect for you in managing your own carbon footprint. So feel the love, Dieter. That's coming through on the chat box here. But I think a message to us all. But there's one coming through. Actually, could Dieter answer the question about replacing land use for animal feed at a national level? So I guess that's more, is that, I'm taking that probably as a sort of scale point, I guess.
So I'm going to upset a lot of people here. Okay, I don't buy the idea that we should give up eating meat, and I don't buy the idea we should all become vegans or indeed even vegetarians. I do buy the idea that we should buy less meat, and I do buy the idea that we should be very, very careful about where our food comes from and how it's put together. Okay, so I eat meat, not often, but I like meat, and I love cooking and I have a big vegetable garden. I absolutely adore focusing on knowing that what I'm eating is produced in a way which has, it's not just the biodiversity bit, but it's it is that, and it's the climate bit, etc. And it has to be good. But I know that quite a lot of my choices I make, I can afford to make, and most people can't. So I find it abhorrent that people can buy very cheap chickens produced in terrible circumstances on intensive feed, grown in very chemically intensive ways too. But on the other hand, I also appreciate there's lots of the population for which £5 for a chicken is a lot of money. So you have to be pragmatic in this territory. The reason I think what I do about meat is, I'm completely open to the objection that my understanding of ecology and biology, etc., is limited. But I don't understand how a purely arable world and grassland world can support soils and the biodiversity that an intelligent combination of some animals puts to the frame. And I have tried to read the literature on this as much as I can. So I think there's definitely a place in the landscape. And I think there's on Exmoor, I think there's a role for Exmoor ponies. And I think there are lots of other examples where animals fit into the frame. Now, the worry is much more about how the cereals are produced, which provide the inputs to the animals. Okay, so there is this obvious point that as you go up the food web, the concentration of the amount of resource required increases. The meat is less, has got much more carbon footprint, methane footprint in it than down the frame. But you need to look too as how the agriculture works. So I want to start the other end. I'm appalled at how much US land is for ethanol. I'm utterly appalled at how much rainforest was cleared for palm oil for renewable transport fuel in Europe until they realize what they've done. I'm horrified by the clearing of trees, etc., and the pelletization and the train that Drax produces so that it doesn't count in our carbon emissions in this country. These things bother me enormously. I think the growing of biocrops and biofuels is almost always negative from a carbon point of view. And what's more, I worry greatly about how the intensification of this is going. And you can see it in Brazil and lots of other places. So, what we actually need is to readdress the entirety of the food chain. And that requires a rethink of agriculture. And if you look around your communities and I look around my communities, what's been the result of this agricultural system we produced? A sort of, and I exaggerate deliberately, but a health nightmare, right? You look at obesity, you look at the diseases that people now suffer from because they eat essentially bad food. It's not literally bad, but in the sense of it could be done so much better. And once you focus on how to get a decent diet in place, and a balanced frame, etc., you start to concentrate on how the land should be used best to produce those outcomes, as opposed to the way it's used at the moment. That's a whole other subject. Yeah. But I just wanted to, first of all, make clear that I do think there's an argument for having animals in the landscape. And I do think that the idea of synthetic manufacture of meat, I mean, if you want to be a vegan, just be a vegan. What the hell do you want a factory-made burger and call it a burger when it's something vegan? Do it properly and stick to that frame. But it's a whole new topic, but it's really vital to you because you have to look at that agricultural system, and that satellite data, and I say helps you map it in order to work out how to get the best ecosystem out of this, the best soils and the best framework without too much of a carbon footprint. And I think the agricultural story is much more important, or at least as important, as the power sector story when we come to the climate implications.
Yeah. So, and as you say, I mean, those are some big themes. I'm conscious there's a few questions I want to pick up. There's a couple that are actually talking about, with the sort of, sort of access you've had to governments, those conversations. But what's your perspective on how much of this is really bought into, in our sort of, politicians, captains of industry, etc.? Where, what's your view on the reality of that?
Well, when I want to console myself, I recognize that politicians are the flotsam of history, right? In my time, there have been more secretaries of state than there were years that I was chairing the Natural Capital Committee. Outside the ministerial office in DEFRA, there's a wall and each Secretary of State's picture is on it. And I recall saying to Steve Reed in that summer, gosh, Steve, you're about to go through a year. It's time your picture was up there. And of course, his picture's up there now. But here we go again, right? But if we were driven by the particular ministers and the politics for these long-term generational issues, I think we should just go away and cry. Now, that doesn't mean you don't engage, and it doesn't mean they're not important. You know, every now and then you get a moment in history where you get the right person in the right place to make the right changes. They're not pure architects in themselves. The conditions have to be there. Brexit produced the outcome that almost everything that was European legislation law was in agriculture and the environment. That's what it was all about, right? And for most of the history of the EU and the EEC, it was a common agricultural policy. It used to be 70, 80% of the total budget of Europe. It's still a significant sum. So when Brexit came along, we had to re-examine agricultural policy. We had to re-examine environmental policy. And then, and I have no political opinion in this frame, and I started off with, because of the comment about I've had enough of experts, a hostility. But Michael Gove turned out to be, against all my expectations, the one bright light in that dozen or so secretaries of state. Remember, we had Truss twice, we had Leadsom once, we had Villiers, you know, you name it. We had Margaret Beckett, we've had them all, right? But he set about rewriting our agricultural policy and our environment policy, and the 2000 Act on Agriculture and the 2100 Act, 2021 Act on the Environment. I think they'll stand like the new legislation when we joined the EU or the EC, and the 1947 and 48 Act. They are the coat hangers, and they're really important. And within the frame of those coat hangers, there are some things which it's easier to stop happening. And after all, a lot of what our leaders do is damaging. But there are some positive wins. And the thing to learn now is don't go along with a positive win which says, and by the way, we'd like the government to spend some more money. There ain't none. It's the starting point. Go along and say, here's the framework, and this is the way you could achieve a much better outcome for the same cost or less. So when I advocate catchment regulation for the water industry, I genuinely believe that people would not be facing 40% increase in bills if they wanted to get the outcomes that they want to get if they'd done it on a catchment regulatory basis. That's a win-win. But what you can't do in our world, which many environmentalists do and farmers do all the time, is demand more money. This time, there really isn't. 38% of the economy is already taxation. There is no more money. And so you have to look for those wins. But you know what? There are a hell of a lot of them once you turn the stones over and look at it with that spirit in mind. And the water system is the one I spent a lot of time on, the rivers. It's just a no-brainer that you could improve the outcomes much more by approaching the whole catchment rather than in silos called water companies and flood defense and so on. But I could bore you for hours on that.
No, a massively important point. And again, I'm trying to sort of do my job as the sort of chair here on some of the questions coming in. So slightly different tack, if I may. We've got time probably a couple more questions, I think. So this is probably a question really about inequality. You know, the question doesn't use terms like the sort of, you know, polluting elite or so on, but I think there are questions around actually, you talk about the polluter pays and sort of from a more of a, I guess, a sort of corporate or sort of sector perspective. But there's a question here about actually, you know, whether we need to look at tax and actually talk about sort of, you know, wealth tax, etc., and how that actually can be used to reduce inequality and fund nature. Just whether that's a sort of a lens that you've got a view on as well.
So two bits here. Right. And I think this in energy policy, but I think this more generally. You know, you would say in economics, I think you should get the prices right. So I think pollution should be priced. If there are people who don't have the resources to live a decent life, and in my legacy book, I'm very keen on universal income. I think that, you know, in order for people to live their lives in a decent way, there's a minimum that they need access to all of these things, including access to nature. It's a social security problem, right? And when you try and make pricing, pollution in particular, income dependent you're confusing an efficiency issue with a distribution issue, and you end up with a much more expensive outcome. You know, if we had carbon pricing properly, we could save a hell of a lot of money in the subsidies, and the cost of the economy would be lower. And of course, the government have a lot more revenue than they otherwise would have done. The second thing, and you might not, this might not go down very well, but in this country, we extract more from the top 1% and the top 10% than virtually any democratic country in the world. Right? And it's remarkable, and people don't naturally go to this, but the Conservatives in the last decade were one of the most redistributional governments Britain has ever seen. And that's incredible. And so you end up with this result that, and that you could see it in the budget yesterday, you know, there ain't much more to get out of the top lot, right? And so we have, what really is the question is the gap between people in genuine poverty and people in the average bit. And the average bit are actually not doing that well. And they're the ones that the politicians dare not raise tax for because there's a lot of voters there. So if you notice the mansion tax, right? I mean, it'll just be capitalised on house prices. But you got in the Commons that cheered from the rafters, right? Because their voters weren't going to pay for this, right? But there's a limit to that. So I don't think there's enough space there. Now, I think at the other end is a digression. But one of the things I try to put to my students is, if we spend X billion on social security in this country in its various forms, why are there any poor people at all? And I put it that way because if you work out how many people are in these poor categories, and you work out how much it would cost to lift them to a decent standard of living, and you take the total spend and divide it by this, you know, you'd realize that we waste an enormous amount of this by not concentrating on poverty. Your questioner was interested in inequality, and this is a personal prejudice, etc. I want to eliminate poverty before I worry about inequality. And we waste a hell of a lot of money not addressing that question. And poverty is not just about money. It's about access to transport. It's about access to nature. It's about having them in your reserves, having their children run around and experience something out of their different from their cramped living standards, etc. And that's where wildlife trusts have a big part to play. You are a big part of relieving poverty in your area, but you're providing an access which too many children in urban areas don't get anywhere near. You can do that. And I know you've got something coming on about prescribing with nature. That's a classic example, right? Yeah. And once you think about it, I'm sure when you've heard it, I don't know the person, but when you've heard it, you'll go away and think, this is a no-brainer, right? And then you see there's another role for you guys to provide some of that going forward.
No, that's great stuff. And I think you're absolutely right about actually that role I think that we all have about how people can get that access and experience. Indeed, you talked in your opening remarks, I think, about the children, I think you mentioned sort of playing in the ponds or something. I mean, I think that sort of those experiences, you know, where people are, that they have that connection and engagement is just not just about the sort of future generation, the things will be needed to bequeath those assets you were talking about earlier, but I think it has all the benefits about just that, you know, their mental health, that joy really associated with those things as well. So I do want to sort of, I guess as we're drawing to a close now, think about that generation, that future, have some of those sort of positive thoughts. There's a nice question coming in at the end here, actually, which is, I think, and this may, I'm not sure if this is quite really a vote yet, Dieter, but it's saying, if you were to become Prime Minister tomorrow, or let's say at the next election, so it's, I guess it's, you know, what would be the first thing that you do? You know, give us that sort of let's hear about that. And I think some of those sort of positive things for the future that you can see we should be getting on and doing, and indeed that you would do if we're going to elect you in.
Okay, so one of the great advantages of having a German name, even though I'm entirely English, is that I could never become elected as a politician. And my father.
I'm not going to let you wriggle off the question. In the event, Dieter, that
okay. So I wouldn't, right? But and I have no desire to do any of that thing or be a regulator, anything of that form. I'm quite happy trying to comment from the outside. But just in terms of that, so I would do what William the Conqueror did in one respect. I wouldn't go around cutting up Anglo-Saxons and doing brutal things of that form, but he did the Doomsday Book. And the Doomsday Book, he having conquered England at least, he wanted to know what was there. He wanted to know the state of the assets. Now, he wanted to know that in order to extract as much tax as possible. I want to know the state of assets because I want to find out where all the improvements can be made. And that comes back to what I said to you about the digital maps, right? We need to know what we've got. We need a balance sheet instead of all this, flow stuff about aggregate demand and aggregate consumption that all my economist friends are obsessed by. I want to know, if I want to know what the state of Britain is, what's the housing stock look like? What's the biodiversity look like? Where are the communications? This is what we need to know. We need to know what our natural assets are, what that frame is. Once you know the balance sheet, and once you've seen the state of the assets, it's now beholden upon you to maintain them properly and then work out how you can make it better. And I hope during the course of this evening that I've tried to get over, despite some quite gloomy things that are out there, this fundamental point that not only is what is unsustainable not going to be sustained, but the scope for improvement is utterly massive. How can it be this bad, right? Generally, is my starting point. Be utterly realistic about the downside of what's happening to us and our environment and the climate, and then think, right, that's our baseline. Now, can you imagine not coming up with half a dozen ideas within 15 minutes of how you could make it better? Right? There's so much possibility out there. And, I don't run anything. I've run businesses, but I wouldn't ever purport to run anything which is publicly interested in the way that you guys are. But, my guess is your problem is there are vastly more things that you could do than you can do. And the problem is how to prioritize which comes first and which is most important. And I will conclude on this point. You mentioned about children, etc. So, and I think I put this in the front of my Green and Prosperous Land book. When I was a kid, I spent a lot of time on my grandfather's farm on the Essex marshes. And I got accused on farming today of being into la farming in the past, etc., because I loved it. But I do remember, and memory from childhood exaggerates things, so I ought to be careful. But I do remember on the fields by the marshes that you couldn't walk through the field without treading on lapwings' eggs. There were so many of them. And, every time I see a flock of lapwings, decades later, that point comes back to me. Why can't I have that now? Right? And if every child had something like that, you build hope and possibilities, and you build your future volunteers.
Peter, I think that's a fantastic point to end on. I just think that scope for that improvement and just holding on to those, as you say, those sort of those experiences when you were young, and actually our responsibility to actually make a difference and bequeath those assets, as you say, back onto those future generations, I think is really at the heart of this. And I think also, as we've covered off through the discussion that, now, the fact that we each can do things, there are choices we can make, there are things that we can get involved in, which I think are all part of making that difference. And I think that is being part of that movement. So I'm going to say, on behalf of all of us, Dieter, thank you. That's been a really fabulous talk, really loads of questions and comments. I've tried to do justice, and there's so many here. Thank you so much to all of you who've joined. I hope you've enjoyed it. I think, Adam, there was just one bit we needed to close on as well about some other upcoming events. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And I popped it in the chat.
Can I just interject one thing? If anyone wants to read my legacy book, this is an advert. This isn't an advert, but you can download it for free from CUP's website. So it's publicly available. And, my objective is to get as many people to think about these ideas as possible. So do read it if you haven't. It's free, and do encourage other people to download it for free as well. But that's an aside.